Committee will be in order. Welcome to the full committee markup of the State and Foreign Operations Bill for Fiscal 16. Let me first, though, say to you again my appreciation for the hard work you're doing so far this year. This is a record-breaking year for all of the modern records that we know about. This week, we've passed 2 more bills out of subcommittee, one off the House floor as of 2:30 this morning, Mr. Chairman, correct? What? It's not, almost there. Final vote today. And we're on pace to bring more of these bills now to the floor. So thanks for the hard work. I know it's taking a lot of your time, but we want to pass as many of these bills as is possible this year. Now let me turn the floor over to the Chairwoman of the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee, Ms. Granger, to present her bill. Gentlelady is recognized.
Sorry. I want to thank the chairman for his exceptional leadership on the committee this year. I also want to acknowledge the work of my friend Mrs. Lowy as ranking member of the full committee and the subcommittee on state foreign operations, even in a year when total spending in the bill is reduced by 11% below the request. We've tried to work together to find solutions our members can support. We have many amendments to consider this morning, so I'll give just a few brief highlights of the bill. All of our committee members know that we live in a dangerous world where terrorists threaten the United States, our allies, and partners in our way of life. We see Russia and China continuing to assert territorial claims against their neighbors, and the threat of a nuclear Iran is real. That is why this bill, at $47.8 billion, 3% below last year's level, must prioritize programs that are in our national interest, our national security interest, including embassy security, assistance to key countries such as Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Ukraine, preventing terrorist safe havens and stopping the flow of foreign terrorist fighters, and democracy programs and international broadcasting. The bill provides robust funding for security initiatives to help our neighbors in Mexico, Colombia, the Caribbean, and Central America. The funding provided for Central America continues to address the tens of thousands of unaccompanied children who have come to the United States over the last year. As I said when we marked up the bill last summer, changes will not happen overnight in these countries. While there is now a joint plan to address shared challenges in the region, more needs to be done by the Central American countries. Security must come first before there can be prosperity. The bill continues our bipartisan commitment to address human trafficking. We must do our part to put an end to what equates to modern-day slavery. The bill also devotes funds to combat wildlife poaching and trafficking. Many members of this committee are concerned that criminal organizations are getting rich off this illegal activity, and we want to protect some of the world's most unique wildlife from extinction. The bill also focuses on critical humanitarian and health programs by rejecting the cuts proposed for these accounts in the President's budget. To address all of these needs, the bill excludes funding for many of the international banks, reduces the United Nations and international organizations by $1 billion below the request, and rescinds accounts where balances have accumulated due to slow spending. The bill addresses key policy issues, including aid to Egypt. At a time of unrest in the Middle East, the U.S. needs Egypt as our stable ally. Funds in the bill and the conditions placed on those funds reflect our commitment to maintaining our relationship with Egypt. The bill makes clear statements about the Palestinian Authority. The PA will not receive economic aid as long as they continue to pursue unilateral efforts at the UN and other international organizations outside of a negotiated peace agreement with Israel. The bill also stops the Palestinians from having representation in D.C. if their hostile actions continue. In closing, I want to express my appreciation for the members and staff of both sides of the aisle who've made thoughtful contributions to this bill. On that note, I want to make sure that Chairman Diaz-Balart did not forget that today is his Chief of Staff's birthday. So I want to wish a happy 29th birthday to Cesar. Thank you. I hope we can work together to quickly report the bill out of the committee today, and I yield back to the chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. Now it's my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee as well as the full committee, my friend Ms. Lowy.
And I want to thank my friend, Chairman Rogers, and my friend, Chairwoman Granger. As I said last week, the Republican budget resolution has led to clear winners and losers in the subcommittee allocations. The State and Foreign Operations Bill is $6.1 billion, or 11.3% less than the President's request, and uses OCO to partially make up for shortfalls imposed by the inadequate allocation. Our security comes from more than military might. Development and diplomatic initiatives around the world are our best defense against political instability, economic disparity, and widespread poverty. The State Department and USAID protect our national interests and are continually called upon to respond to spontaneous, unanticipated, or simultaneous crises, including Ebola in West Africa, the refugee crisis in Central America, the earthquake in Nepal, and the devastating conflicts in the Middle East and Africa, all in the last year. In such a challenging geopolitical landscape, the State Department and USAID unquestionably need funding that is unmet in this bill. In addition to drastic cuts to family planning and women's reproductive health, this bill reinstates the global gag rule and prohibits U.S. contributions to UNFPA. Evidence shows time and again that these programs lead to fewer unwanted pregnancies, fewer abortions, and fewer maternal and infant deaths. Instead of eroding the progress we've made on both maternal and child health and access to family planning services, we should focus on expanding quality health care programs so that women can better care for themselves and their families. This bill also proposes a severe retreat from our engagement with the United Nations, the World Bank, and other multilateral organizations. Our bilateral efforts are strengthened by strong multilateral investments in international organizations such as UNDP, UN Women, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development, all of which are completely unfunded in this bill, and UN Peacekeeping, which is capped. These organizations leverage our investments, leading to significantly greater impacts than we can achieve on our own. Unfortunately, this bill also falls short on addressing climate change, which directly affects the safety and economy of the United States and erodes advances we've achieved in the developing world. The bill's approach to Central America is misguided, failing to address the root problems behind the violence and poverty that stifle these countries. Our efforts must address institutional weaknesses, corruption, and the region's poor records on human rights, police, and judicial system. Like many of the other appropriations bills, this one contains new politically motivated provisions that are purposefully divisive and aimed at literally undercutting the administration. The proposed 15% cut to the State Department's operating funds if officials don't feed the sham investigation of Benghazi is simply atrocious. If the majority is so focused on transparency and protecting taxpayer dollars, they would be better off cutting the unlimited funding for the Select Committee, which has existed for over a year and produced zero substantive information. This bill restricts funding to establish a diplomatic presence in Cuba. Through engagement with Cuba, the U.S. is better positioned to press for human rights, civil liberties, and freedom of assembly, speech, and religion, all of which the Cuban people desperately deserve. However, despite the shortcomings, there are positive aspects of the bill, and I want to express my deep appreciation for the Chairwoman's efforts to include many of our priorities as possible, including sustaining our commitment to embassy and diplomatic security and providing robust funding for basic education. The bill also continues the unwavering support and robust funding for our close ally Israel and $1 billion to support our partner Jordan. We also reaffirm our commitment to global health, investments including nutrition, maternal and child health programs to combat tuberculosis, malaria, and pandemic threats, as well as PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiative. However, I remain gravely worried that the deep cuts will leave us vulnerable to the spread of extremist ideology, substantially weaken our standing in the world, and make it more difficult to achieve our goals on the global stage. I'll be offering a number of amendments to bolster our development and humanitarian efforts, spur economic progress, and improve national security. Before I close, I want to again express my appreciation to the majority staff, Anne Marie Chatfax, Craig Higgins, Alice Hogan, Susan Adams, Anu Mother, Clelia Alvarado, David Bortnick, Mickey Smith, Johnny Caberly, as well as my hardworking staff, Steve Marquez, Aaron Kolodziejski, and Maren Stein. We have a great team, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Lowy. You know, when we finish the defense bill this morning, that will be the 6th bill of the 12, which means we're halfway. And it's not even middle June yet. So thank you for your perseverance and your hard work. We want to continue to bring these bills out. In fact, this morning, just before this meeting, the Financial Services Subcommittee marked up their bill, thanks to Chairman and his subcommittee, and that bill, in due course, will be before this committee. This bill rightly prioritizes national security, providing critical aid to our strategic allies, securing key diplomatic posts, and investing in programs that will grow democracy across the world. This funding will help find and defeat terrorists, prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, support peacekeeping operations, and fight drug trafficking. The bill also helps democracy worldwide, targeting funds to life-saving development, global health, and humanitarian aid programs. Yet the security and future prosperity of our nation relies on making sure that we don't become beholden to our creditors or shove the burden of our debts onto the backs of our children. So this bill makes responsible decisions to trim funding from lower priority programs. In conclusion, let me again thank Chairwoman Granger and the subcommittee, and Ms. Lowy and the staff, as she has listed them, for drafting, I think, a well-balanced, conscientious state and foreign operations appropriations bill. I'm proud to support it, and I urge the committee to promptly report it to the House. Is there further discussion on the bill? If not, are there amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will Read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Granger. In the report on page 16 before the paragraph relating to workforce diversity, insert the following new paragraph.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the chairman. This is an amendment that Mrs. Lowy and I have worked out together, and I hope members will support it. The amendment includes non-controversial report language on the following: U.S. citizens detained in Iran, International Boundary and Water Commission, neglected tropical diseases, HIV/AIDS programs, agriculture in Ukraine, confiscated property in Romania, and elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This amendment reflects the bipartisan spirit that Mrs. Lowy and I have sought to maintain throughout the process. I urge the adoption of the amendment and yield back to the chairman.
Ms. Loy.
I rise in support of this amendment, and I thank the chair for working with our side to address a few issues that arose after subcommittee consideration of this bill. The minority has no objection to this amendment.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Kaptur?
Yes, Mr. Chairman and members, Chairman Granger and Ranking Member Lowy, I rise in support of your amendment, and I want to thank you for your inclusion of two priorities important to the future of liberty in Central Europe. This bill appropriately includes crucial provisions related to Ukraine, made more critical by Russia's invasion of that country. One such vitally important area deals with U.S. aid to Ukraine. A photo has been passed out to each of you, and I ask you just to look at it, particularly the woman who looks like she's walking with a cane, but in fact, that is a scythe that she uses to cut hay to feed her animals. The role that rural women play in feeding and holding Ukraine together remains critical. Despite deep and currently deadly challenges, the language we inserted into the report demands USAID seriously focus on and directly engage rural women and mid-sized to small holders who live at the edge of subsistence. Women too often marginalized and pushed to the edges of society, yet they are raising upwards of a third of the food that supplies that nation internally. Second, in partnership with our Hungarian caucus co-chair, Representative Andy Harris, we've included language expressing concern about the status of restitution of church property by the government of Romania. The changing borders of Europe over the past century have muddled the religious property issue for restitution, and it is our responsibility to stand on the side of human rights and religious freedom, most especially in countries still viscerally dealing with the dark legacy of communism. Again, I express my support for the amendment and my sincerest gratitude for the collaborative efforts of both Chair Granger and Ranking Member Lowy in including these priorities in their very important bill, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion? Hearing none. Questions on the manager's amendment by Ms. Granger? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Ms. Lowy.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to offer an amendment.
Clerk will designate.
I ask unanimous
Which
consent
one?
to dispense with the reading.
She has three.
The gentlelady will yield. Which amendment is it?
This is the first, number one.
The reading is dispensed with.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Lowy.
Mr. Chairman, this bill has a long-standing tradition of a spirit of bipartisanship, and that is why I was so dismayed by a new provision in this year's mark, dragging politics into the central operations of the State Department. This provision, innocently titled Preservation and Transparency of Department of State Records, is merely the latest effort in the Republican crusade to profit politically from the tragedy of Benghazi. This incident should motivate us to responsibly carry out reforms to keep our diplomats safe. Instead, it has inspired a scapegoating political exercise to influence the 2016 presidential election. The chairperson of the Benghazi Select Committee, Congressman Gowdy, has been brazen in touting this proposal to cut State Department funds based on claims of delays in information sharing. This is a red herring. The State Department has already provided 45,000 documents to the Select Committee, including Secretary Clinton's Benghazi-related emails. In addition, the department has provided 5 briefings, witnesses at each of the committee's 3 hearings, 18 witness interviews. How is that non-cooperative? I object to allowing the critical programs this bill funds to help the most vulnerable people around the world to be exploited for a destructive, frivolous political attack. I support transparency, and I get as frustrated as any member when agencies are slow to respond to congressional inquiries. These are real challenges, and there are real challenges out there. Since 2008, state has seen its FOIA caseload increase by more than 300%, jumping from fewer than 6,000 to about 20,000 last year. And that would be a challenge for any department, and the State Department is addressing it. This is not a case of denial. The State Department's IG has looked critically and clear-eyed at the matter, issued recommendations in a March 2015 report. The department is following up on the recommendations and should reasonably be given more than 2 months to fix these problems. It is completely, in my judgment, illogical to cut staffing and resources with the expectation they will respond faster. This provision is counterproductive. Maybe my amendment should increase funding for staffing of that office instead of simply eliminating the absurd cut to State Department operations. So as I said in my opening, this provision is really a sop to the Benghazi sham investigation wrapped in the theme of transparency. This is punitive, political, hack job, has no place in this bill. I strongly urge my colleagues to support my amendment to strike it.
Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. I think we can all agree that transparency and accountability in government are at the very heart of our democracy. Section 77(7) of the bill is aimed at getting the State Department to take immediate action to remedy significant deficiencies in the department's official record keeping. These deficiencies did not come to light in the past few months. They were documented for years in many reviews. For example, the Center for Effective Government's analysis of the 15 federal agencies that received the most Freedom of Information Act's requests ranked the State Department dead last for both 2014 and 2015. The Center's 2015 report stated the Department of State score was particularly dismal. While its website is a bright spot for the agency, its 23% processing score is completely out of line with any other agency's performance. On whether agencies had updated their disclosure rules, the Center's analysis rated the State Department as having the lowest score, a rating of only 33%. The State Department was the only agency in the scorecard whose rules did not require staff to notify requesters when processing is delayed, even though this is mandated by law. Inspector General reviews of the State Department's messaging and archive retrieval systems in 2012 and 2015 found confusion among department employees at all levels about the same requirements and procedures for preserving emails that involve critical business. The 2015 review found that although the department upgraded its system in 2009 to facilitate the preservation of emails as official records, known as record emails, department employees had not received adequate training or guidance on their responsibilities for using those systems. Additionally, the review concluded that employee actions to preserve official emails varied widely across bureaus and missions. Out of over 1 billion emails sent by department employees, only 61,156 record emails were created in 2011, and less than 42,000 were created in 2013. The Inspector General also noted the absence of centralized oversight, a lack of understanding and knowledge of record-keeping requirements, and a reluctance to use record emails because of possible consequences. Again, I say to my colleagues, transparency and accountability in government are at the very heart of our democracy. The State Department's Freedom of Information Act and record email problems are longstanding and need to be corrected immediately. I urge rejection of the amendment.
Mr. Rippersberger.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. First thing, I do want to acknowledge the leadership of the Appropriations Committee. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, I've served on the Defense Appropriations and this committee. And Kay Granger, I really appreciate your leadership. You've been very fair. Rodney Freeland has in the same way. And, you know, the Appropriation Committee is a very important committee. It's a very prestigious committee. We have a real mission to do what's right for American people. But I have to stand up on this cut. And what I'm really concerned about is that when you cut, or fence, not cut, but we're fencing 20% or 15% of an operation budget of the State Department, who is very much involved with all the international issues we deal with, all the threats that we deal with, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Russia, China, whether it's the cyber issues that we're all dealing with. I think it's the wrong mechanism. Chairman Granger, I don't disagree that we need to oversee and the things that you said, but I feel this is the wrong train to get on to deal with that. This will affect us. The American people want us to be strong when it comes to international threats. So I would hope that we could consider this. We might not always agree on issues, but this committee has been a good experience for all of us because we've been fair, and that's the leadership and ranking members who've been involved with that. So I hope we can reconsider this cut. The American people, and let me say one thing about Benghazi. The committee that I came from for the last 4 years, we had thousands of hours of research. We came out with a report on the whole Benghazi issue, which was a very serious matter. And we had a unanimous vote. It was a voice vote coming out, dealing with every single issue that is here. Now, the Benghazi committee, I don't believe should be in the Appropriations Committee. Let them do what they need to do. And by the way, their budget, if we want to talk about priorities, was higher than our whole intelligence budget, and we oversaw 17 committees. So in closing, let's hopefully find another mechanism to deal with Chairman Granger's issues, but not take away operations which will affect the United States of America.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
Section 777 does not cut 15% from the department's operating
I
budget.
didn't mean cut, I mean fence.
You use the word cut.
I take that back. I should not have done that.
It simply fences off the funds until the Secretary of State makes the certifications required concerning the department's preservation of official records and the response time for retrieving such records. These are not difficult requirements, they're common sense, and I again urge a no vote on the amendment.
Let me back my time. I just think that this is not worthy of our Appropriations Committee to do it this way. That's my issue. I yield back.
Mr. Rooney.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to clarify something that Mr. Ruppersberger just said. And Dutch, I have the utmost respect for you, but you mentioned in the Intelligence Committee that the Benghazi vote was unanimous. It was not unanimous. I can tell you that because I did not support it. That's all I have to add.
Is there further discussion? Let me just say, we all appreciate the dedicated service of State Department personnel around the globe. They sacrifice a lot for our country. They serve in many difficult locations, even dangerous. So we appreciate the work of the personnel of the State Department. However, this agency doesn't recognize that they are responsive to the American public through the Congress, specifically through this committee. All agencies that use discretionary funding that we appropriate has an obligation to be as forthcoming and as full as they can, as rapidly as they can, to the requests of this committee for information. State Department is at the bottom of the list on those that are responsive to this committee. That will not be tolerated. Now, this is a severe fencing of 15% of their operating budget. That's pretty severe. But it, I think, recognizes the importance of the information that is being requested of the State Department, not only by the Congress, but by the press and the public through these FOIA requests. The backlog of FOIA requests at the State Department is more than any other agency of the government. Now, I've been around doing this stuff for 35 years. And it's the same now as it was then. The State Department just does not respond to anybody. And that just simply will not be tolerated by this committee. We can't afford not to have the latest information as rapidly as can be had. And they have not, they've not passed the test. Now, they can quickly remedy the problem. This fencing, of course, is what it is. It's a fence put around a sum of money that can be removed and will be removed when State Department furnishes information we've requested. So I strongly support the gentlelady's position. To close, Ms. Loy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have already detailed the extensive steps the State Department has taken to provide the requested information. It's hard to keep up when the goalposts keep moving. As I've made clear, I am all for improving accountability, transparency, and congressional oversight. I know my chair is very concerned about the large number of FOIA requests, and I do not think she intended this provision to politicize our bill. But some outside our committee have made it a punitive political gimmick. At a time when we're dealing with various failed states, civil war, the rise of ISIL, multiple humanitarian catastrophes, we should not withhold the State Department's funding, our best defense against these and many other daunting challenges, and I hope my colleagues will support this amendment. I yield back.
The question is on the Loy amendment. All in favor, say aye. All opposed will say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Request for a recorded vote is supported, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fattah. Mr. Fattah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger.
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel. Mr. Israel, aye. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly. Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy.
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Aye. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Rupersberger. Mr. Rupersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Ms. DeLauro? I vote.
Ms. DeLauro, aye.
Any others wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 20, the nays are 30. The amendment is not. Ms. Lowy.
This is amendment number 2, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Lowy.
Unanimous consent
Without objection,
dispense.
reading is dispensed with.
As my colleagues have heard me say before, there is no way this appropriations process can succeed unless we put in place reasonable allocations. The bill we are considering this morning is a very good example of how such unrealistic allocations jeopardize the interests of the United States and harm struggling communities around the world. My amendment proposes to restore funding to several accounts that are cut by the chair's mark, which, if enacted, would be to the detriment of programs that help people become self-sufficient, provide for their families, have the infrastructure to get their goods to market, and help build government institutions that protect human rights, legal contracts, and better serve their citizens. The mark cuts $2.1 billion, or 54%, from the request for basic economic support funds. These funds don't just support our strategic allies, like Jordan, they also support the most fragile states in the world, such as Liberia, South Sudan, and Somalia. They fund the programs so many of us support: democracy, clean water, education, and agricultural training. My amendment would bring the ESF account to the FY16 request level. It would also restore funding to the international organizations and program account and to several of the multilateral institutions, which are completely eliminated by the chair's mark. The IO&P account provides critically needed core funding for major UN programs, such as the United Nations Development Program, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and UN Women. U.S. voluntary contributions to these international organizations leverage assistance from other donors and target international support for key U.S. priorities. Making voluntary contributions through the IO&P account has been a consistent policy for Republicans and Democratic administrations. My amendment would also restore funding for several of the international financial institutions that are completely eliminated in this mark. The U.S. plays a leadership role in the Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, and many others, but that influence is dependent on our continuing participation. I've attached my amendment, a letter to my amendment from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that raises several good points, including on the value of the Multilateral Development Bank. It says, the MDBs provide vital financial assistance to developing countries with minimal investment but significant impact. I couldn't agree more. And I can't figure out why, in an environment of constrained resources, we wouldn't turn toward the institutions that leverage each one of our taxpayer dollars and stretch them to go much further. I hope my colleagues will undo this short-sighted decision and support this amendment. I yield back.
Chairman Granger.
I acknowledge the concerns of the gentlelady and what you've raised about the accounts in the bill, but this amendment is not offset, therefore I must oppose it. The amendment would cause the subcommittee to breach its subcommittee 302B allocation, expose the bill to a point of order, and stop our bill from being considered on the House floor. As I said in my opening statement, the bill prioritizes funding for programs such as embassy security, security assistance, humanitarian assistance, and global health. The bill's total funding level is 3% below last year, and we had to make some tough decisions. None of us want to see the bill go over the 302B allocation, therefore I urge a no vote.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to rise in support of this important amendment and thank the ranking member for calling attention to all of these important programs that the United States needs to be engaged in. But I particularly want to focus my remarks on the Green Climate Fund portion of the amendment. This helps countries across the globe to address climate change and its impact on their economies, their natural resources, and the health of their people. I know you all hear me say this frequently, but I hear from my constituents all the time about the impact of climate change by hardworking men and women in Maine who make their living from the ocean, the land, working in our forests. So it's not a shock that the citizens of other developing countries are facing these same harsh realities too, on their farms and in their waterways. The Green Climate Fund is an essential way to support initiatives in developing countries that might reduce greenhouse gas emissions or shrink a carbon footprint. The United States has the world's best farmers, fishermen, and researchers, all who can be resources to other nations as they try to think creatively and act quickly on these issues. We don't all need to agree about the causes of climate change to support this amendment. We only need to agree that the United States should be involved in the global effort to address it. If we walk away from the GCF, our voices won't be heard, others won't learn from our experience and from our science. I support this amendment today, and I urge my colleagues to support it and thank the ranking member for putting it before us.
Any further discussion? Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you. I rise in support of the gentlelady's amendment. In addition to the comments made by the gentlelady from New York, I think it's important to emphasize that our contributions to these institutions are critical to making sure that we can export the United States of America's values, that we can demonstrate that we are a country that believes in lifting others up. Those contributions are important for food security. Organizations and programs that improve agricultural development and food security through capacity building and sustainable technical assistance. The chairwoman has made a commitment through this legislation to move in that direction, but we have so much more that we need to and should be doing, and with all due respect to the chairwoman, who I think always does her level best to produce a solid bill, we do want to increase the 302B allocation. We absolutely do, because the levels that we're at are unacceptable. They're unacceptable for us to do what we need to do for women and girls. Many of the initiatives and programs that these institutes fund emphasize increasing women's participation in decision-making. Congresswoman Lee and I just got back from Malawi and Kenya, and I don't think it can be overstated, what the impact on the lives of families in villages across Africa, how those are changed, transformed from ones that result in their children dying from malnutrition and from families' inability to take care of the children that they are having, to making sure that they can make their own financial decisions and establish the essential independence that leads to making sure that generations of their family break that cycle of desperate poverty. So for all those reasons, and because we are in a posture where we shouldn't even be debating bills at these levels, and we should get to the point that we know we're going to all end up at the end of this year, towards the end of this year, and that is an agreement on setting aside the sequester so we can appropriately be debating a funding level that is going to meet the needs that the United States of America prioritizes. Thank you. I yield back.
Further discussion? Hearing none, Ms. Lewis recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We know that in a budget, there are always tough decisions. We have to make some tough choices. But many of the cuts proposed in this mark really are counterproductive. Decreasing assistance to some of the toughest spots in the world, pulling back from our international partners will only hurt U.S. economic and security interests. Partnerships with the multilateral organizations strengthen our bipartisan efforts. The mark does not trim funding, it completely unfunds whole institutions. Safeguarding our development investments in the face of a changing climate, combating food insecurity, building the next generation of markets for U.S. businesses are not options, they are our responsibility. I hope my colleagues will support this amendment and reverse many of the counterproductive cuts in the mark. Yield back.
Question is on the Lowy amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no. No. Noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Sufficient support is showing. Call the roll.
Mr. Adderhold. Mr. Adderhold, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Mr. Dent? Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger?
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel? Mr. Israel, aye. Mr. Jenkins? Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly? Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Mr. Kilmer? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Rupersberger? Mr. Rupersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Kilmer?
Mr. Kilmer, aye.
Ms. Capter?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to vote aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Ms. DeLauro? Ms. DeLauro, aye.
Any members wish to change their vote?
Mr. Stewart?
Mr. Stewart?
Gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Stewart, no.
Members wish to change their vote? Clerk will tally. While we're waiting a moment here, special announcement. Mr. Visklosky's son is getting married this weekend. We want to congratulate him at some point during the morning's process. Congratulations, Pete.
It starts at noon tomorrow, Mr. Ryan. So the best present you could give is to talk to others to move things along, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Point well taken. On this vote, the yeas are 21, the nays are 30. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? Ms. Lowy,
Number 3.
clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Lowy.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, the underlying bill denies basic family planning and health care services. It leaves women vulnerable to preventable diseases and weakens their ability to contribute to their families' and communities' economic stability. It bans all funding for the United Nations Population Fund, the largest multilateral family planning and reproductive health provider in the world. Its effective voluntary family planning policies and programs contribute greatly to the U.S. Comprehensive Strategy for Sustainable Development. It also includes a divisive policy rider, the Global Gag Rule, which bars foreign organizations from receiving U.S. family planning assistance if they use their own private funds to provide information, referrals, or services for legal abortion, or advocate for the legalization of abortion in their countries. I have repeatedly moved to only strike these provisions that are harmful to women and families around the world, which my friends in the majority have rejected. Yet each year, we remove the offending language to pass a more responsible foreign aid bill. This year, my amendment would permanently remove the global gag rule so that recipients of U.S. foreign assistance are not held to standards that would be unconstitutional here in the United States of America. In addition, it would strike the prohibition on funding of UNFPA and provide $35 million in assistance to UNFPA. This amendment does not change any of the current provisions in law that restrict the use of family planning funds. This amendment maintains language prohibiting the use of U.S. funds by UNFPA for their China Country program. This amendment maintains reductions in U.S. contributions to UNFPA, dollar for dollar, in the amount that UNFPA spends of its own money in China. This amendment maintains the requirement that UNFPA establish a separate account so that U.S. contributions are not commingled with other contributions. Now again, to be clear, the United States does not, cannot fund abortions. The Helm Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, enacted in 1973, prohibits the use of foreign assistance funds to pay for the performance of abortion as a method of family planning or to motivate or coerce any person to practice abortions. My amendment would not change this. Prohibiting UNFPA, reinstating the global gag rule, severely erode the progress we've made on both maternal and child health and access to family planning services. Instead of making it more difficult, my friends, for women to access quality care, we should support programs that help women and their partners ensure their health and the health of their families. Evidence shows time and time again that these programs lead to fewer unwanted pregnancies, fewer abortions, fewer maternal and infant deaths. So I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and remove these counterproductive and harmful provisions. Yield back.
Chairman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the gentlelady's amendment. This amendment would do four things. It would strike the provision reinstating Mexico City policy, include new language overturning the Mexico City policy permanently, strike the prohibition on funds for UNFPA, and provide $35 million for UNFPA from an undesignated account. First, let me discuss the Mexico City policy. This administration overturned the policy when it came into office. Without it, organizations that receive taxpayer dollars for overseas family planning services could have more funds available to pay for abortion services. The amendment also would strike the prohibition in the bill on funds for a U.S. contribution to the UN Population Fund of UNFPA. UNFPA received no funds during the previous administration because it was determined to have supported coercive abortions in China in violation of the Kemp-Kasten provision in our bill. Nothing has changed with regard to China's coercive policies, and nothing has changed at UNFPA. In addition, China is now a donor country and finances development projects around the world, yet UNFPA insists on funding programs in China. Finally, this amendment does not identify from which account the UNFPA contribution would be made. That would allow the administration to reduce other congressional priorities in the bill by $35 million. I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to reiterate Mrs. Lowy's point here that there is absolutely no evidence that the global gag rule has reduced the incidence of abortion globally. In fact, study after study has shown the most effective way to decrease abortions are to increase women's access to family planning, services, and supplies. The global gag rule has played politics with women's health for 30 years. So respectfully request that we end this debate once and all by finally and permanently repealing the global gag rule. Thank you.
Further discussion. Ms. McCollum.
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of the amendment. Think of what we're talking about here, a global gag rule. A global gag rule. We are the country that promotes freedom of speech and for information to be shared, transparency. So let's be transparent about what UNFPA does. UNFPA opposes any use of coercion, violence, forced abortion, sterilization, violations of basic human rights, and limiting births. What do they do in China? Well, they work to improve women's health and the health of their babies, to get communities to abandon female genital mutilation, to prevent and treat domestic obstetric fistulas in their own countries. It focuses in their work in China is to end the one China policy, and they do that by having open discussions about family planning. This amendment does nothing to change the intent of how tax dollars are spent to promote abortions. But what this amendment does do is it allows freedom of speech. It allows for women to get full access on their own health, the health of their children, and getting the right kind of information on family planning. So I support the amendment, and I thank the gentlelady for bringing it forward.
Thank the gentlelady for agreeing to the Visclosky dictum. To be brief. Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I will be brief. But let me just say how much I appreciate the gentlelady for offering this amendment and rise in strong support of it. We strike the global gag rule policy, also strike the ban on U.S. funding for UNFPA. It's really shameful that there's language again in this bill that would reinstate the harmful, and it is a harmful, global gag rule known as Mexico City. This rider blocks funds from organizations that provide critical health services to some of the poorest women in the world, unless that organization agreed not to use its own, mind you, its own private, non-U.S. funds to provide any service related in any way to abortion. That's not government overreach. I really don't know what is. The misguided Mexico City policy, it's incredibly counterproductive. When it was actually put in place, and now in place with this bill, it really does interfere with doctor-patient relationship by restricting accurate information a health provider may want to provide. Mexico City gag rule is restricting family planning, not abortions. This amendment still restricts funds for abortions, which of course I totally disagree with, but this amendment does not change that. Simply put, the global gag rule harms women's health and really contradicts our country's funding priorities. There's no evidence that the global gag rule has reduced the incidence of abortion globally. Study after study shows that when women have increased access to family planning services and supplies, such as contraceptives, the incidence of abortion decreases. So let me just say, when I was a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, years ago, I worked then on that committee to strike this harmful provision. And it's really shameful that we have to keep going through this because this is unnecessary. It's a counterproductive battle. So I'm pleased that our ranking member has introduced this. We should have a permanent repeal of the global gag rule. Also, I'm supportive of the Global Democracy Promotion Act, which would ensure U.S. foreign aid policy promotes freedom of speech around the world. That's very consistent with what this amendment is seeking to accomplish. So I hope we will vote for this amendment. As Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz mentioned earlier, we were in Malawi together, and women and men talked about the need for family planning. They want to reduce the number of children that they have. They want to space their children. And this allows that. It allows for their empowerment. It allows for them to take care of their families. So I hope we support this amendment. Thank you.
Further discussion? Hearing none, Ms. Lowy is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Existing law already ensures family planning programs are voluntary, bans foreign aid from being spent on abortions, prohibits funds to organizations that support coercive abortion or involuntary sterilization. Again, my amendment is not an expansion of choice or abortion. It just allows aid recipients the ability to use their own resources within the legal constraints of their country as they deem necessary. And it provides funding to UNFPA to improve the health and well-being of populations in other countries, especially those of women and children. It promotes internal stability, social and economic progress. My friends, we know this is the right thing to do. Join me and support this amendment. I yield back.
Question is on the Lowy amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. Noes seem to have it. The noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to. Sufficient number requesting a recorded vote. The clerk will read.
Mr. Adderhold. Mr. Adderhold, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr. Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel. Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly. Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder. Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no.
Other members who wish to be recorded or change their vote? Mr. Israel.
Mr. Israel, aye.
Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Bishop, aye.
Ms. DeLauro.
Ms. DeLauro, aye.
Other members? If not, the clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 22, the nays are 29. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Serrano.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask permission to waive its reading.
Without objection.
An offer by Mr. Serrano.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment seeks to increase funding by $5 million to counter revisionist Russian media and reduce the same amount for the funding provided to the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. We're currently spending more on Cuba Broadcasting than we are on counteracting Russian propaganda when it is very clear who the threat is to us and to the world. As every member of this committee knows, I strongly support the President's policy of improving diplomatic relations with Cuba. While not everyone in this committee agrees with me on improving relations with Cuba, I think we can all agree that Russia is a threat not only to the Ukraine, but also to other former Soviet republics such as the Baltic states. The Kremlin is behind a sophisticated propaganda campaign against its neighbors and the West. Russia is spending hundreds of millions of dollars in propaganda each year, whether it is through TV, radio, or the internet. It was recently reported by the Washington Post that the Russian government even has a small army of internet trolls to spread misinformation on the internet. In short, Russia is using every means at its disposal to sow internal discord in other countries in order to weaken their democratic stability. If we do not increase funding for this account, we risk losing the information war. We can prevent further Russian aggression by supporting a strong effort to counteract Russian propaganda. Not doing so will have terrible consequences for the national security interests of the United States and its allies. I urge adoption of this amendment, and I remind us that the broadcasting to Cuba has been in many, many ways a total failure over these many, many years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairwoman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. While I strongly support efforts to expand U.S. international broadcasting activities targeted countering Russian aggression, I cannot support it at the expense of cutting funds for broadcasting to the Cuban people by nearly 18%. As members know, freedom and access to news in Cuba is highly restricted by the Cuban regime. Now is not the time to cut back on broadcasting to provide the people of Cuba with a reliable and credible source of news and information. With respect to countering Russian propaganda, the bill already includes the full $15.4 million requested by the President for fiscal year 2016 to continue and expand international broadcasting programs to counter Russia. These funds are in addition to increases provided in fiscal years 2014 and 2015 to expand such activities. I'm not confident that the BBG can effectively absorb another $5 million increase as the amendment proposes. I am, however, willing to work with the gentleman as we move forward in the process to review with the BBG the capacity to further expand its activities targeted at countering Russian propaganda. I urge members to vote no on the amendment.
Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Serrano amendment to transfer funds from the Office of Cuban Broadcasting to counter Russian media. As Mr. Serrano stated, we know that Russia is spending millions of dollars to actively spread misinformation. And they've been rather effective at doing it, as we've heard from our own news reports. Russia is a threat to Ukraine, as we know, the Baltic states, and ultimately a threat to our national security. This $5 million would be much more effectively put towards countering Russia propaganda machine than wasting the same dollars on outdated, unnecessary, and ineffective radio Marti programs. And why do I say that? Well, over the past 30 years, more than $770 million in taxpayers' dollars has been spent broadcasting, and I'm going to call it propaganda, into Cuba, with $28 million appropriated this fiscal year. Now catch this fact. According to the U.S. government-sponsored research, Radio Marti's listenership is less than 1%. Less than 1%, folks. $28 million, less than 1% of the Cuban population. And the number of Cubans that watch TV Marti is even smaller. So if we want to get a good bang for our buck, if we want to make sure that people who are engaged in getting the truth and wanting to know what's going on in the region of the Ukraine, we should at least be able to take $5 million out of $28 million and put it to where people are going to be tuning in and listening. I support the amendment.
Ms. Kaptur.
Yes, I rise in support of the Serrano amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. Let me just say that if you follow what Russia is doing in Central Europe right now, she has increased her broadcasting in the Russian language or the native language in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even Poland. And there is a concerted effort to try to reroute the kind of brainwashing that I don't think it's going to work, but it is very, very serious. She's also employing her assets here. And if you look at some of the articles that just happen to spontaneously appear in the newspapers, and you sort of look at some of the lobbying firms being hired to prowl these halls and other places, it is a very serious resurgent Russia that we are dealing with. So I thank the gentleman for his amendment. I think it would be a much more effective use of $5 million. And we have to counter the media war that Russia is now embracing fully. And I think this is a very helpful amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
Ms. Lee.
Chairman, first of all, let me associate myself with all of the remarks that have been made and thank Mr. Serrano for this amendment. I've long really very adamantly opposed this wasteful spending, and it is wasteful spending on the Office of Cuban Broadcasting, which a study by the Committee on Foreign Relations stated as listened to by fewer than, I believe my colleague said, 1% of Cubans. it's really a reflection of this committee's priorities, which I think are misplaced. This is a radio station that really hasn't accomplished much, and we're wasting taxpayer dollars on this. I actually was a staffer when this was instituted. I haven't seen much change in Cuba as a result of Radio Marti. And so I think it's time that this committee really address the real priorities of this world as it relates to Russia, for example, which has invaded neighboring Ukraine, a much greater threat than Cuba, which, thank goodness, was finally recently taken away or removed from the list of state sponsors of terror. So I thank my colleague for this amendment, and I hope within the priorities of this committee with minimal resources recognize that this is really a waste of money.
Mr. Serrano may close.
Thank you. I thank my colleagues for their support, and has been said by some of the colleagues. First of all, on the issue of Cuba broadcasting, the Radio Marti, 1% of the people have listened to it. It hasn't made a change, if that was the purpose of changing the government. Number two, on TV Marti, the joke for a while, for many years was, and I've been on this and other committees for a long time dealing with this issue, was that once TV Marti was seen in Cuba over a 10-year period, and it was a Popeye cartoon show that had nothing to do with Popeye, was not anti-Cuba in any way, shape, or form. And then we know about Russia and the problems that we're having and the world is having. And so transferring this $5 million and keeping with the rules of the committee to have an offset, transferring this $5 million is good use. It makes two statements, but the strongest statement is that we will not sit by and not have something to say about what Russia is doing to its neighbors and trying to do to the world. So I would urge a yes vote on this amendment.
Question is on the Serrano amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. Noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Roll call is requested. As sufficient number, the clerk will tally.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Mr. Dent? Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel? Mr. Jenkins? Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly? Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Mr. Allard? Mr. Robo Allard, aye. Mr. Rupersberger? Mr. Rupersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano?
Yes.
Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded? Mr. Israel?
Aye.
Mr. Israel, aye.
Mr. Graves?
Mr. Graves, no.
Mr. Lauro?
Ms. DeLauro, aye.
Are there other members who wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 18, the nays are 33. Amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Farr.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to just speak on the Peace Corps budget. I don't have an amendment, but I'd like to say something.
Gentleman moved to strike the last word.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the committee for marking up to the Peace Corps, but I would hope, I mean, it didn't get last year. And what I want to tell this committee, I went to a conference this weekend in Afghanistan. They found that the areas in Afghanistan that were most acceptable to our troops coming in have been where Peace Corps have been stationed for over 40 years, even during the Taliban. And the people there were very friendly and not fighting, and there was peace in the area. The tragedy here is that it's the most popular job for Americans to apply for in the federal government. There's 20,000 people that are going to be turned down next year because we haven't appropriated enough money. And the jobs are there. The Peace Corps is in 64 countries. 20 more countries have asked for Peace Corps volunteers, and all the 64 countries want more. So we have essentially jobs available for American citizens that are not expensive, and what lacks is just the money. The president's asked for $410 million. That's not very much money considering what we're arguing on the floor today with the defense budget and the total budget here in foreign ops. So I would just like to bring it to the attention of the committee. We had 158 members ask the committee to support the president's mark. I don't think there's any other letter to any subcommittee that's ever had that many members ask for it, and it's bipartisan letter. So I hope when we go into conference that that our leadership here will be able to find the funding in this sense. We're all about jobs. These are American jobs, and they are not costly jobs. And the bang for the buck overseas is just remarkable. And you'll hear General Eikenberry and others say that if we had Peace Corps in a lot of these countries, we would not have to send the military. So let's do the ounce of prevention and try to get the money to at least allow these Americans to get a job. Thank you very much.
Ms. Lowy?
I just want to thank my good friend for your advocacy for the Peace Corps. Wherever I've traveled during my many years in the Congress, I always managed to have a meeting with the Peace Corps. And to see these young, dynamic men and women committed to helping others and understanding how important it is to bring about peace and security around the world really makes our heart feel good. And I know of our chair's commitment to the Peace Corps as well. And I look forward to working with you and the chair as we move the process through, and hopefully we can do a good job of justifying their great work and the need for additional resources. So I thank you for bringing this issue to the committee. It's not a partisan issue. The chair supports the Peace Corps. I would assume that everyone in this room supports the Peace Corps, and thank you for your remarks.
Mr. Fattah.
Mr. Chairman, can I move to strike the requisite number of words?
That was recognized.
I want to thank the chairwoman and the ranking member for the second time now. In the report language on page 37, we've added Alzheimer's as a challenge for the world and asked USAID to think through the needs and the cost effectiveness of approaches. And there's been a great call worldwide for a global fund similar to what we've done in other instances. I just wanted to make it clear that this report language really means that, at least as far as I'm concerned, as the requester, that USAID would put forth some framework to think about how the U.S. might engage with the other countries around the world who are interested to have a global effort on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, in these dementia-related issues, which are threatening all of our economies. And USAID saw this language last year, and they weren't enthusiastic enough to proceed forward. So I wanted to take a minute and just ask the chairwoman and the ranking member, maybe we could work as we go forward to make it clear what we intend by this language. Thank you.
Chair wishes to announce, we thought we had until 1:45. We don't. We got until 12:30. So we got to be quick and brief and concise and precise. So bear that in mind. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk
I
will
ask
read.
that the reading be dispensed.
Which one is it?
Amendment number 1.
Number
Wasserman
one,
Schultz
clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you, Mr.
Page-
Chair.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with.
I want to ask everyone in this room to raise your hands if you had an opportunity to decide how many children you wish to have if you have children. Was that something that you actually had some ability to control? Anybody? Anybody? Who had the ability to control how many children they had? It's unfortunate for my friends on the other side of the aisle, but most Americans in our country do have that opportunity.
Would the gentlelady yield?
If you don't mind, I'd like to actually get through some of my remarks, and I'd be happy to yield to you in a moment.
Absolutely. I would just ask as you move forward that you not impugn or that seemed offensive to me.
I'm sorry that you find it offensive that I'm asking
I'm-
members if they have an opportunity to choose how many children they have, or
Honestly,
to at least
I'm totally fine
engage
answering
in
the
family
question,
planning.
but throwing it open like it's a game is
It's not a
is
game.
bothersome.
This is not.
I'm sorry to
Reclaiming
interrupt.
my time, with all due respect, this is not a game, which is why I'm offering the amendment. So with all due respect to the gentlewoman from Washington, we do have that opportunity in America. And this is not a game. It isn't a game for the women all across this globe. And that is why my amendment would simply lift the cap that the committee has placed on funding for family planning. Time and again, domestically and internationally, data shows that information about and access to planning for our families decreases unwanted pregnancies and abortions. Worldwide, every year, 53 million women experience unintended pregnancies, and 25 million women obtain abortions. An estimated 225 million women in developing countries want to delay or avoid pregnancy, but have an unmet need for family planning. I recently met several of them, along with Congresswoman Lee, as we've discussed, on a care learning tour to Malawi and Kenya. On that trip, I spent time with a lot of amazing women, and I got to know personally one woman in Kasungu, Malawi, Estri Chilomba. Estri is 41 years old and has 8 children, 7 daughters and 1 son. Unlike many of the women in Malawi who are married and pregnant before they're 18 years old, Estri had her first child when she was just 22. But similar to most of the women in Malawi, Estri began her family with no access to contraceptives, no knowledge of child spacing, and no resources to obtain either of these two things. This resulted in Estri and her husband having more children than they were capable of caring for at the time, leading to economic instability, difficulty paying for their education, and the malnourishment of herself and her oldest daughter because there simply wasn't enough food to go around for 10 people. As I talked with Estri about our families, our hopes and dreams for each of our children, I thought about how my ability to space and plan my family and the ability for most Americans to do the same has created security and opportunity for my children, and as such will create that same security and opportunity for their children. Estri and her children and women and their families across the globe deserve that too. Every woman in the world deserves that too, and access to life-saving education and resources about family planning should not be contingent upon where a woman is born. That is why this amendment to lift the cap on family planning is not a game. It's deadly serious. Because women in countries like Malawi, where women have so many children that half of the population is under 18 years old, women like Estri need and deserve access to the resources and knowledge that have helped so many of us in this room plan for our families. Placing a limit on these funds, my friends, is arbitrary and does a disservice to our overall goals of supporting maternal and child health, ending preventable child and maternal deaths, and supporting economically sound and secure communities. I yield back.
Ms. Granger.
I rise in opposition to the gentlelady's amendment. Thank you. The amendment would strike the funding cap for family planning programs in the bill. The amendment would give the administration the flexibility to reduce funding for child survival programs, tuberculosis, malaria, vulnerable children, and UNICEF by allowing funds to be redirected to family planning. The global health funding in the bill takes into account the lower family planning level. So if you raise the family planning levels, then other health programs will be reduced. I urge a no vote on the amendment.
Mr. Quigley?
Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of your 12:30 deadline, I would cut my remarks in half and simply add, there are 225 million women in developing countries that want to delay or avoid pregnancy but have an unmet need for family planning. 40% of all pregnancies that occur in developing countries are unintended, and each year approximately 290,000 women worldwide die from pregnancy-related causes. Complications related to pregnancy and childbirth is the second leading cause of death among young women ages 15 to 19 globally. Fortunately, investments in family planning and reproductive health services have many benefits. They reduce unintended pregnancies, maternal deaths, infant and child mortality, and mother-to-child HIV transmission. These investments also advance the rights and empowerment of women and girls. I support this amendment and thank Ms. Wasserman Schultz for proposing it.
Thanks for the gentleman's brevity. Ms. Lee?
Also, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz for this amendment. The United States should be a global leader in family planning services. We are the largest bilateral donor. Because of this funding, in fiscal 2016, 6 million unintended pregnancies and 12,000 maternal deaths were averted. Capping our investments in bilateral family planning at $461 million, that's nearly a $150 million cut to current funding levels. This would result now in 3,000 more maternal deaths and 1,400 million more unintended pregnancies. And I know that's not what we want to see. These caps would have a devastating impact on women and men and takes us back really from our leadership on these critical issues. Family planning and reproductive health are key to our priorities of ending child and maternal deaths and achieving an AIDS-free generation. So I hope we support this amendment. It makes a heck of a lot of sense. And we know for a fact that women and men want to plan their families. Thank you.
There being no further discussion, Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized to close. Gentlelady waves. Question is on the Wasserman Schultz amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. Noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Recorded vote is requested. Sufficient number. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei? No. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Mr. Dent? Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fattah? Mr. Fattah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger?
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Hero Butler? Ms. Hero Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel? Mr. Israel, aye. Mr. Jenkins? Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly? Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Aye. Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visclosky? Mr. Visclosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no.
Other members who wish to be recorded? Gentlemen,
Gentleman is not recorded.
votes no.
Mr. Calvert, no.
Any other members wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk, Ms. DeLauro.
Mr. Lauro, aye.
Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 21, the nays are 30. The amendment's not agreed to. Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word to have a very brief colloquy with the chairwoman.
Gentleman's recognized.
Listen, first I want to thank the committee for the report language on page 53 under minority communities that brings attention, hopefully, of the State Department to enhance the delivery of humanitarian assistance and resettlement service to minority communities. But I would proffer that, and this dates back to the Bush administration, there's a hesitancy at the State Department to recognize the religious overtones of what's going on in the Middle East. And the fact, we call them minority communities, but what they really are persecuted religious minorities. And I don't care whether it's Christians, Jews, Yazidis, Mandaeans. The fact of the matter is they're persecuted for one reason: it's their religion. And, the gentlelady from Florida said, we should be exporting U.S. values in the State Department. One of our primary U.S. values ought to be, American values, is that we preserve religious freedom. And when we see 21 Christians beheaded on a Libyan shore, it should affect you and move you, no matter what your religion is, as an American. And I would just ask the chairwoman, I understand this, I thank you for this language. Not sure it goes far enough to nudge the State Department to what they ought to do. As you know, with the issue with the sister a month ago who couldn't get, the Dominican sister who couldn't get an exit visa to come here to the United States, religious persecution, that hopefully we can work a little bit better and perhaps toughen it up a little bit, the final product, so that we give the message to the State Department, this is a religious war we're fighting. This is not about the color of one's hair or the color of one's eyes, or any, this is about your religion. And that these minorities have no chance of resettlement back in their home countries, and that perhaps we should go to the UN, the High Commission on Refugees, get them designated as religious persecuted minorities for the purpose of resettlement, and help these persecuted minorities. Thank you.
Thank you. We do carry language in the bill regarding challenges facing minority communities in the Middle East particularly. I'd like to work with you on that and see if we can make it as strong as we possibly can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Back.
Mr. Quigley?
Thank you. I have an amendment at the desk. I'd ask that we waive the reading.
Without objection,
Mr. Quigley.
meeting is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there are over 12,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies that say that climate change is real and that man contributes significantly to that. For those of you keeping track at home, there are zero peer-reviewed scientific studies that say that climate change is not real and that man does not significantly contribute to that. Look, there are a lot of facts and figures, but you see it in your own districts. Tell me you don't know of more and severe droughts, effects of climate change like wildfires, the number and the severity of storms. In my district alone, we've had 300-year storms in the last 5 years. But there's something we can do about it, because this isn't just about protecting from those issues. It's about national security, because national security does include protecting Americans from things like pandemic disease and natural disasters. Climate change poses a very real threat to American families as extreme weather and rising sea levels threaten infrastructure, homes, and people's lives. The Strategic Climate Fund is a multilateral effort that supports 3 major projects toward this end. The Forest Investment Program supports developing countries' efforts to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation through policy reforms and public-private partnership. The Pilot Program for Climate Resilience pilots ways to integrate climate change and resilience in core development planning. And finally, the Program for Scaling Up Renewable Energy creates new economic opportunities for low-income countries. It increases energy access through the production and use of renewable energy. By taking these new approaches to climate change, the Strategic Climate Fund has the potential to significantly change the track the world is on. Unfortunately, this bill currently zeroes out the Strategic Climate Fund contribution, falling short of the U.S. pledge to this crucial initiative. My amendment would add back $59.62 million to this account, meeting the President's request and fulfilling the pledge that our country has made toward this effort. And for the interest of time, Mr. Chairman, I will end at that. Thank you.
Ms. Granger.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. The amendment is not offset, therefore I must oppose it. The amendment would cause subcommittee to breach its subcommittee 302B allocation, expose the bill to a point of order, and stop our bill from being considered on the floor. None of us want to see that happen, therefore I urge a no vote.
Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. All you need to do is visit my district, which represents much of southeast coastal Florida, to see the effects of climate change, particularly on sea levels, and on the growing devastating impact that every hurricane season brings. We have massive beach erosion. A recent Miami Herald story noted that sea levels could rise by as much as 6 feet by 2100. 6 feet. The national security implications that Mr. Quigley mentioned are real. The effects of a major natural disaster can impact our defense infrastructure as well. There are many supporters of the defense community here. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew, one of the worst hurricanes to ever strike the continental U.S., irreparably damaged Homestead Air Force Base in Miami. In 2004, damage from Hurricane Ivan kept Pensacola Air Force Base closed for almost a year. Don't take it from me. Let me reference former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel's remarks late last year. He said, among the future trends that will impact our national security is climate change. Global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, climbing sea levels, and more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. He goes on to say that the Defense Department will take a proactive, flexible approach to assessment, analysis, and adaptation. It is irresponsible for us to shirk our duty here. The chairman has said that fundamentally national security is our priority, and I urge the committee to recognize the real and serious threat that climate change poses to our national security and support the gentleman's amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
Hearing no further discussion, the gentleman's recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there are few issues beyond climate change in which our children's children will recognize our effort or lack of effort. If there's one thing I think they'll be truly unhappy with us about is the fact that we have done very little to affect climate change, and that will have extraordinary impacts on their lives and whether or not they can even have children's children of their own. Thank you. And I encourage a yes vote.
Question is on the Quigley amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Noes have it. The amendment's not agreed. Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If you just give me 1 second, I'd just like to apologize to the chairman and the chairwoman and ranking member about running in and out. Today was a day set many weeks ago for my granddaughter's 4th grade class to come and to visit. So at one point I had half a dozen of them running with me to make sure I made the vote. So a little bit of madness, but you do whatever you can for your grandkids, right? You do whatever you have to do. I have an amendment at desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. DeLauro.
Unanimous consent.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is co-sponsored by Ms. McCollum and Ms. Lee, and what it would do is to add $35 million in this bill for the United Nations Population Fund, or UNFPA. The funding is to be used only for specific programs and activities affecting the health and the quality of life of low-income women around the world. These include, among other things, reducing coercive family planning practices like coerced abortion and involuntary sterilization, providing contraceptives, preventing and treating cases of obstetric fistula, promoting the abandonment of female genital mutilation and forced marriages, and working to ensure safe childbirth and emergency obstetric care. The challenges that women face around the world, and particularly in the developing world, are immense. According to UNICEF, more than 125 million women have been forced to endure acts of genital mutilation. 2 million women live with untreated obstetric fistula in the developing world, and more than 50,000 new cases occur every year. Obstetric fistula is it's a preventable condition. It's caused by days of prolonged labor and the resulting of the eviscerating of internal tissue. Women have suffered in this unspeakable way because of child marriage, early pregnancy, lack of maternity care, or even because their husbands would not let them go to a hospital. And many women suffer even a worse fate. Every day, approximately 800 women die from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. Almost all of these maternal deaths occur in developing countries. More than half occur in the sub-Saharan Africa, and almost a third occur in South Asia. The figures, as well as these practices, like female genital mutilation and sexual violence against women, are an outrage. They profoundly impact the health and the well-being of entire nations. Countries in Africa, Asia, Middle East cannot escape extreme poverty when half the population is neglected. Efforts to protect women in conflict zones, fund child maternal health programs are critical, but also for sustainable global development. This amendment funds those efforts. It's a small investment. We can have a profound effect on women's health around the world. And here in the developed world, we have tools at our disposal to deal with complications and deaths that all too often are a risk for women. This amendment allows UNFPA to make these interventions available to women in the developing world as well. And I ask for a yea vote. Thank you, Mr.
Chairwoman Granger.
In opposition to this amendment, the amendment strikes the Mexico City policy, strikes the prohibition on funds for UNFPA, provides $35 million for UNFPA and certain maternal health. I share many of my colleagues' concerns regarding women's health issues. That's why this bill provides $882 million for maternal and child health. It also instructs USAID to increase funding for programs to prevent and treat obstetric fistula. I don't believe this amendment's about supporting programs. It's about UNFPA, and I've made my position very clear on that. I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Ms. McCollum?
I do want to acknowledge that the chairwoman has some good things in this bill, for maternal child health, prevention of child marriage, early marriage, but with the allocation that we're given, and with our withdrawal because of the allocation that we're given from partnerships with UNFPA, with other United Nations organizations and the World Bank that help with a multiplying effect in improving women's lives, improving the survival rate of children. I rise in support of this. If we get an opportunity to get a better allocation in here, the biggest bang for our buck for national security is when women succeed and children succeed, communities are more stable, nations are more stable, and that contributes to world security and our national security. So I really hope that, Mr. Chair, and to the chairwoman, if we get a bigger allocation, we can look at investing more and doing more for women's health, whether it's obstetric fistula, whether it's family planning, and the support services that women need to be healthy so that the mothers are there to help their children survive. With that, I yield back.
Ms. DeLauro is recognized to close.
Just in closing, and just to echo my colleague, Ms. McCollum's words, I would love to work with the chair and the ranking member, particularly in the area of obstetric fistula, an area in which I've spent a lot of time looking into. And with the myriad of problems that are faced, this is something that is preventable or that we can address in a way that can make a difference. In some instances, the problem is so big that you cannot address it. But this is one where what you could bring, you transform a woman's life. Often these women are left in huts, you know, at the mercy of animals and so forth. This is not rhetoric, this is a reality. And so that where we can, and if there are additional funds, that if we could focus in this area, I think it would bring so much more to the ability of women to be productive and to have families and to be able to take care of those families. And I will close with that, Mr. Chair.
Question is on the DeLauro amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Ms. Lee.
An amendment at the desk. This is Lee number 1.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Lee, page 12, beginning on line 20.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you. This amendment would increase the level of base funding for the contribution to national peacekeeping activities. This is known as the SEPA account. This would increase it to the level which the President requested of $2.93 billion. It would also lift the 25% cap on United States contributions to UN peacekeeping operations, allowing us to pay our peacekeeping dues at the full assessed rate of 28.36%. I appreciate all that our chairwoman and ranking member have been able to do to support peacekeeping activities in this bill. But the matter of fact is, UN peacekeeping missions are currently facing a number of critical and challenging demands, so it is essential that they receive full funding through this account. UN peacekeeping missions constitute the largest deployed military force in the world, with more than 120,000 personnel deployed at 16 peacekeeping missions around the world. All this with an annual budget which is less than 0.5% of the world's total military expenditures. That's why it's also essential that this committee oppose the peacekeeping cap included in the bill and ensure that flexibility is provided so that credits from previously appropriated funds may be used to pay for current bills. By adding these new restrictions and keeping the cap, we could weaken ongoing peacekeeping operations that are critical to United States national security, including Mali, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and other African countries. The U.S. must continue to play a central role in its support of the United Nations peacekeeping activities on the African continent and other places around the world. We really do get a big bang for our buck, Mr. Chairman, and I hope we would support this amendment. Peacekeeping is so important in this very dangerous world, and this cap should be raised, and we should fund it at the level that the President requested.
Chairwoman Granger.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. This bill currently funds U.S. contributions to the UN peacekeeping missions at last year's level, even though the subcommittee's overall allocation was reduced from last year by more than $1.4 billion. The amendment is not offset when causes to exceed our subcommittee allocation. Very important, the amendment would also allow our contribution to UN peacekeeping missions to exceed the statutory rate of 25%. This means that there would be no limit on the share the U.S. could be asked to pay. I oppose the amendment and urge a no vote.
Any other discussion? Question is on the Lee amendment. All in favor? Sorry?
I just ask for an aye vote. Thank you, Mr.
Question is on the Lee amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. A sufficient number is requesting a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amade. Mr. Amade, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Culberson? Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fattah? Mr. Fattah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Feelinghuisen? Mr. Feelinghuisen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Hero Butler? Ms. Hero, no. Mr. Honda? Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Israel? Mr. Israel, aye. Mr. Jenkins? Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Jolly? Mr. Jolly, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no.
Other members who wish to be recorded?
Mr. Cuellar?
Mr. Cuellar.
Mr. Cuellar, no.
Any member wish to change the vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 20, the nays are 31. Amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Mr. Chairman, I have Wasserman Schultz 2 at the desk.
Amendment offered by Ms. Wasserman
Unanimous
Schultz.
consent for the reading to be
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief because I believe that Chairwoman Granger has a response, and if the response that I'm expecting is forthcoming, then I am prepared to withdraw the amendment. But it would add language to the bill affirming that our assistance to Central America is intended to promote economic and educational opportunity, democratic governance, and respect for human rights, in addition to the priorities laid out in the bill. I think, as I said earlier, making sure that we can export American values and make sure that we emphasize the importance of human rights and dignity is critical for us to express in the state foreign operations appropriations legislation. Following last year's crisis at our border, in large part driven by instability and insecurity in the Northern Triangle, all branches of our government, including this one, realized that we needed a sound and comprehensive policy to respond. And I agree with many of my colleagues on this committee and in the administration that we have a national security and humanitarian imperative to finding meaningful solution. We need to look at the root causes of that instability and the migration of tens of thousands of children to our southern border. Economic stagnation, instability, a lack of access to education and to basic services, and fundamental governance structures that do not fully support their own citizens. I mentioned at our subcommittee hearing last week that unless these factors are confronted, children and families will continue to flee rather than remain in situations that are often dangerous with few opportunities and little hope. In the administration's request, these funds were intended to contribute to the evolution of an economically integrated Central America that is fully democratic, provides greater economic opportunity to its people, promotes more accountable, transparent, and effective public institutions, and ensures the safety of its citizens. And this is an initiative that Vice President Biden has been at the forefront of, and I commend his leadership on this very important matter. The appropriations at this committee, though, that we're providing and that we've presented does not fully address these concerns. Our security assistance and the Central American Regional Security Initiative in particular are critical components of our foreign policy and national security strategy in this hemisphere. However, our assistance can not only focus on transnational criminal groups, organized crime, and border security. As such, this amendment would allow and expand for important and meaningful human rights and basic services so that we can make sure that we give these young people and others a reason to remain in their home countries, rather than search, as human nature will inevitably lead anyone facing similar plights, will inevitably lead families to try to find and make a better way of life for themselves. Thank you, and I ask support for the amendment.
Chairman Granger.
I thank the gentlelady for raising these issues and say that, as we've talked about, nothing in the bill prevents funds for these purposes, but I believe strongly that security should be the highest priority at this time. I commit to working with you on these issues on the bill as it moves forward.
I appreciate that, and with that assurance, I withdraw the amendment.
Amendment's withdrawn. Ms. Lee.
Chairman, this amendment is Lee, amendment number 2.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Ms. Lee, strike line 8 on page 175 through line 5 on page
No objection.
176.
The reading is dispensed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise again with an amendment to strip a misguided and really regressive, outdated rider that would delay the establishment of normalized relations with Cuba. My amendment, which I am proud to co-sponsor with my colleague from New York, Mr. Serrano, would strike language included in this mark prohibiting funds from being used to establish a U.S. diplomatic presence and mission in Cuba beyond what existed before President Obama's historic announcement in December of 2014. I understand why these riders continue to make it into these bills. There are members who just don't agree with a new policy toward Cuba. They'd rather stay 50 years ago in the past, and so I got that. Even though American businesses believe that trade would be important with Cuba, the amendment, my amendment, and many others that we've offered, we have broad support from the Greater Tampa Chamber of Commerce, Church World Service, American Society of Travel Agents, National Foreign Trade Council, the ACLU, the U.S. Agricultural Coalition for Cuba, and many others. Renewed diplomatic relations with Cuba are the key to finally putting to rest the many outstanding issues, and none of us disagree. There are outstanding issues that my colleagues have pointed out that must be resolved, from property ownership to human rights and democratization. There are issues on our side, such as Guantanamo and other issues. So our head is not in the sand about this. An embassy is not a concession. It's the means by which our country can pursue its national interests by engaging directly and candidly with a foreign nation. But stubbornly attempting to block the march of progress towards normalization with these misguided amendments is wrongheaded, and it will ultimately put this committee once again on the wrong side of history. We can't go back 50 years. So I'm going to withdraw this amendment, but I hope that my colleagues will speak up and begin to understand that hijacking this appropriations process to attempt to set us back, that the momentum has caught up and move forward in terms of restoring relations with our neighbor in Cuba. So thank you, and I yield.
Did the gentlelady withdraw the amendment?
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
Amendment is withdrawn. Mr. Serrano?
I'll yield.
You can strike the last word
Strike
if you
the
like.
last word.
I was proud to co-sponsor the amendment with Ms. Lee. I understand her desire to withdraw it. But this also brings up an issue that I think you folks all have to look at, regardless how you feel about this. There is existing now in Cuba what is called an intersection. There's a building where we have members of our State Department serving there, just like they have an intersection here. My understanding is that there is no desire or no need to build a new embassy, but rather just change the intersection director to a either Lee or Serrano ambassadorship. Other than that, there's really no change. So the question I ask of the chairwoman would be in the future or today, does the language that exists now keep that intersection in place? Because that intersection can simply be turned over into an embassy by just replacing the personnel or the head. You don't need to create a new building. The building already existed as an embassy before and exists as a intersection now. Something to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word and comment on
Chairman is
this.
recognized.
I've been to Cuba, I think 6 or 5, 6, maybe 7 times. I've been involved with the intersection there. We have a beautiful ambassador's residence there. We can't call it an ambassador's residence, but it's the intersection. I mean, there is really no cost involved in creating this embassy, but it is absolutely essential and kind of crazy that we don't. I mean, here we're debating on the floor tomorrow a TPA which would allow us, or we would set the standards for how we're going to trade with many countries, including Vietnam. We have an embassy in Vietnam. Every single country in this hemisphere, except the United States, has an embassy in Cuba and has relations to them. We have 100,000 Americans that go to Cuba every year illegally. They don't get a visa, a license. And I don't know why we want to stumble so much to look so foolish in the world that we want to negotiate treaties with communist countries of China and Vietnam and so on, but we refuse to have any kind of dialogue with a country that's just 90 miles off our shore. What are we so afraid of? And why are we so kind of ignorant about trying to create some relationships so that our goods, American goods, and our personnel and our ability to go and flood the island with American democratic ideals by denying us an opportunity to have an embassy, or denying us to trade, or denying our American aircraft from flying there. It just seems to me ridiculous in this time of age, and makes that whole debate tomorrow look kind of crazy. Thank you.
Are there other amendments? If not, recognize Mr. Adderholt for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to favorably report the State and Foreign Operations Appropriation Bill for FY16 to the House.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. 3 days to the gentlelady. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be given the authority to make technical and conforming changes to the items approved today. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned. Well, there we go.